All right, finally to the interesting part. All right, yes, I want to accept the terms of this license. All right. And what I want to do is I want to click on Create a New Virtual Machine. Now, normally, you might actually want to run, let's say if you had a Windows 7 DVD, you could run it off of the installer's disk. But since we've got an ISO image, I'm going to have you choose the installer ISO image and go ahead and browse out to your desktop, because I think everybody stored theirs on their desktop. Yeah, go ahead and make a new virtual machine. And I'm going to put Ubuntu Desktop. Now you'll notice down here it actually says Ubuntu 10.10 detected. So if you see that, you're good. If you don't see that, then there's a problem. Okay, it's just going to turn away out there. Yeah, Liz, let's see. Yeah. Oh. No, I trust the Ultimate Edition, and it didn't like it. Yeah, so yeah. Yeah, go ahead and hit next. Hopefully that's okay. All right, it's detected. Success. All right. You're welcome. All right. All right. So let me have you click next. And let me have you put your name in there. I'm just actually just going to put my last name, Horvath. I'm going to put Horvath in there as well. I'll put my password, that top secret password, ABC123. That, yeah. No, go ahead and put your, Chris, you could just put Chris as your name and as your username. I'm going to call this my virtual machine name, and I'm going to call it Ubuntu Computer Club, or just Ubuntu Computer. And what this is actually going to do is it's going to create the files that represent this virtual machine. Now you'll see out there it says the virtual machine's hard disk. Now this is actually going to make it look like this virtual machine has 20 gigabytes. Now this hard drive is actually an 80 gigabyte hard drive. I'd say probably about 20 gigabytes are already used. So I'm actually just going to accept the defaults. Now remember, if you are going to be running more applications or installing more services, you probably would actually want to allocate more disk space to this virtual machine. But I'm just going to have it as a single file. And what I can do is I can customize the hardware. Go ahead and click on that. Now this option lets you decide how much physical memory you're going to put out there. So in my case, I'm actually going to accept the default of 512 megabytes of RAM. But you'll notice out there, you can actually have a maximum amount of memory of 4 gigabytes. Now 4 gigabytes is the amount of physical RAM that's installed on this system. I wouldn't recommend giving it 4 gigabytes of memory because, as you can see, memory may occur beyond this size because we actually only have 4 gigabytes of physical RAM on the system. Now processors. We can actually go in and put 2 processors out there. I'm just going to actually just say that I just want 1 processor core out there. All right. For my new CD-ROM, I'm going to actually use the ISO image file. We'll see the connect on, power on. This defines how we're actually going to have our computer recognized on the network. You'll notice out here it says NAT used to share the host IP address. So whatever IP address we have configured for Windows 7, we're going to also use that for our Linux Ubuntu. Now if we wanted to have one of those multi-tiered systems, we would actually have to go in and bridge, connect directly to the physical network. And in those cases, we would have to go in and actually specify the IP address for the network interface device. But it would actually virtually go out there and create another virtual connection. Now, for our USB controller, in this case, again, it's going to reflect the physical hardware that we have. Our sound card, I'm not sure whether it's actually going to like our sound card or not. All right. but it hopefully will detect our printer and our display. All right. But typically, these are the three settings you want to look at. The network adapter connection. Again, this is just configuring as a NAT. That's network address translation. That's the easiest one to configure. Number of processors and the amount of memory. So let me do OK and finish. And I'm just going to click OK and remind me later. Now, as soon as it starts up, you'll notice it says ISO Linux. It's actually booting up from the installation file, from that ISO image. All right. Now, what's nice about this virtual machine, because it actually detected Ubuntu 10.10, and we already put in our answers, for instance, for our username and our password, this is automatically going to do the install for us. It'll automatically partition a disk, giving us a root partition and a swap space, because Linux always needs Linux swap space. It will automatically create those. Now, one thing you'll notice out here, all right, cannot log, we don't need to worry about that one. You'll notice out there it's going to say installing, verifying the initial connection, configuration. And now basically what it's going to do is it's going to go out and install a whole version of Linux Ubuntu. Now, again, this is just a series of files, and let me actually show you because it's going to take a little while. You notice it actually simulated a SCSI disk type of connection. We really have an IDE hard disk, but it looks like the system that it's SATA. But in the Linux Ubuntu, in the VMware player, it's actually interpreting all of our disks as if they were SCSI disks. Now, let me show you where it actually saved all of this. All of this information is actually stored in a series of files. And if we needed to, we could actually take these files and physically move them onto another computer. So that's another reason people like to use virtual machines as well. Because if something happens to this base hardware and we made a backup of these files, it would be really easy for us to get back up and running just by copying these files onto another physical machine. All right. All right. Now this part pretty much is just going to sit there for about 15 or 20 minutes, or a little less, hopefully. All right. Now, I wanted to mention a couple of things about the more extensive versions of this piece of software, the VMware Workstation. There is actually a free 30-day trial if you want to download it and install it on your own computers. All right. The neat thing about this is that when you go in and do the installs, you can actually have more control over the number of processors. For instance, if you had one processor with 2 cores, you could actually say that was a system that had 2 processors on it in the virtual machine, which is pretty neat. Okay. The other thing that you can do that I mentioned earlier is you can do a snapshot when the virtual machine is powered up. And this actually would allow you to go back to a previous state of the virtual machine. Now, unfortunately, that capability isn't in the VM player because this is the freeware. Now, another thing you can do is when your virtual machine is powered down, you can clone it. Now, this powered down and powered up, that actually is as if you had booted up into a real physical computer. But you can actually control this up here for the virtual machine, if I click on this, you'll see that it says power, power off, suspend, reset. I can actually control it as if I were turning off and on a physical machine. All right. So it's really nice. Like I said, you know, like with the suspend, that's actually kind of like the sleep mode in a Windows-based environment. All right. All right. So any questions on any of this? Yeah, Marty.
Two quick questions.
Yeah.
If we were actually installing Ubuntu without the virtual
Machine. Right.
would we see that exact same blue screen?
Yes. It would. Everything that's in here with that, yeah, with the blue background, yes, it would be exactly the same thing. Yeah.
And the second question is,
Yeah.
when you take files that you've copied
Right.
to other machines,
Right.
are the virtual machine software, are those proprietary? Like if it's on VMware, does
Yes.
it have to be VMware?
It has to be VMware. Now, I don't know about this new Zen. You might be able to run VMware images on Zen, but pretty much it's like if you made something that would run a virtual machine that would run in VirtualBox, you couldn't run it under VMware. But that's a good question. All right. Well, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about today, because we'll just have to wait to see what happens with this. Yeah, because in just a few minutes, like I said, probably about another 5 or 10 minutes, this will be done. Install it. All right. So, oh, you're rebooting. Okay. All right. All right. Well, since we have some free time here, I feel I might as well just mention what we're going to talk about, what the talks that are coming up. In 2 weeks, Mickey's going to give a talk on some Cisco software. It's called a packet tracer. It simulates routers and switches in a network. So you actually, just like our virtual machines out there, these basically have more or less virtual routers and virtual switches. So he's going to discuss how that works. And then 2 weeks after that, Olivia is going to return with Linux Multimedia Studio and basically teach us how to create a dance tune. And she had to go back to work, but no, she's going to do that. And I think after that, I'm going to actually do a class on building, a club meeting on building up your own PC. So we'll talk about, how you can put a PC. We'll take one of the PCs apart. We'll put it back together so you can see, do some hands-on work. But we'll also talk about buying hardware that actually is compatible with Linux Ubuntu. Now, Linux Ubuntu, especially the Ultimate Edition, runs practically on any piece of hardware you'll find. But there are certain motherboards, certain CPUs that actually work better with Linux. So we'll talk about one set of them that actually works really well. It does use an AMD processor, but that's what I'll be talking about, kind of to tie in this whole Linux thing, because we're all about open source. Well, let me actually tell, since we do have a few minutes, let me talk about what this Linux operating system is. Now, I know a few of you are actually already taking Linux, or you're taking it this semester, and you already know that Linux is just awesome. It's open source. It basically is freeware. You don't have to purchase it. You can purchase support for various versions of Linux. It's written mostly in the C programming language, so it's highly customizable. People can actually go in and optimize certain pieces of software like Apache. There are basically thousands of free software like OpenOffice that runs on Linux. There's also OpenOffice for Windows as well. There's a lot of software like the Linux multimedia systems. There's the Blender, which is a 3D modeling software. There's the GIMP, which is sort of similar to Photoshop. There's database management systems like MySQL that runs on there. There's email systems. There's Apache, the web server. So there are a whole bunch of not just desktop applications, but also server-based applications that run on Linux. And even though it is free, there's a lot of support online. So if you have a question or you get error messages, a lot of times you can just go and paste them in a search engine and you'll find the answer to it. There's a huge community of people that are working on Linux that are supporting it. So that's why you get some really good fast feedback. And if you have a problem with something on the system, odds are someone else had the same type of a problem.